Hi, I'm Linda. I'm gonna be your fellow host of today's workshop, and we'll be talking about CSS animation. We will create sort of like a personal website for our Discord bot, or at least it will be a website inspired by our Discord bot. We will be talking about some nice ways to animate buttons using only CSS, and we will also touch upon colors and fonts and have a very basic animation of an image. So let's start with a tour of what we're gonna do. So this is the website. If you open the editor, you're gonna find everything in the YouTube description, every file. So I have a picture here in SVG, which is scalable vector graphics, but you can use any kind of pictures or images. I got this from w3.org. Really cool things. I used SVG because this is the best for CSS animation. And then I also have a very basic HTML. You see, like there's a title here, the link to the CSS image one we're gonna use the animations on, a basic text, and the bottom we're gonna practice the transitions, and then finally there is a big picture we will be practicing transforms on. You see that I put some classes here like wrapper 1, wrapper 2, just in case I want to edit the whole container. It's much easier because if I put more content in there, I would apply the changes to all the content in there. So this is a nice way of using, but I also added an extra class to this robot. We're gonna use actually on both pictures, so we can target the pictures. And then there is the style sheet. I will be explaining every single part in more detail later on, but what I've done so far, so this is a website inspired by Discord. So at first I went to Discord, very funny, opened in the view, developer, and then toggle developer tools. Yes, so here you see all the secrets of Discord. And you can see these are the fonts used, but I chose another font because I like that more and I think it's still similar, but I could have chosen these ones. And over down here, you see the colors, the color palette that's used. I chose the background color, background primary. This is our background color. And I tried to go and get the red color, you know, when, oh, you have a new message and that kind of red for the button. When you look at these colors, I hope you will not get scared. So these are all things you talked about in class. Here, these are only hex colors. I think it's a very simple way of describing the color, especially if you don't need opacity. If you need opacity, RGBA is simpler, you know, red, green, blue, and then the percentage of the opacity in the end. HSLA is also very similar. The first being the color, and then the gray, and then the black and white, with which 0% is black and 100% is white. And then the end, it's the opacity. Cool. So this is where I got my colors from. Going back here, we were talking about the fonts. So I went on to Google Fonts over here. Cool. I really like this one. I don't know, if you have a personal preference, you can use another one. And then up here, you can just select this font. This will appear here. Click on it. So what I did was to click on Add Import, copied this, paste it here on top of the CSS. Going back, it also tells you how to use it. And I did use it like this here. So it's very simple. I think that's the end of the tour. And let's start with transformation basics. Transforms, transitions, and animations are all things CSS can do, but their names sound so similar they can be misleading. All three terms sound like they could possibly make something move, but not all three of them actually do. Let's dive into transforms first. We can take these normally flat rectangular objects in our HTML document and kind of twist them around into different looking shapes. On the technical side, transforms change the shape and position of the affected content by modifying the coordinate space. I will use this robot image to demonstrate some of the things transforms can do. So let's go to our CSS and try to apply some transforms to translate this blue robot. We've applied a class of big robot to our image, so we can apply our transforms there. We will apply transform to our blue robot that translates it over, let's say, 300 pixels to the right. And to translate it over to the right, I will use translate X. We will save this transform in our CSS and then go back over to our browser to see how our image has changed. It's been moved over to the right by 300 pixels. Wow. Translate can also take other units like ems and percentages, but keep in mind that percentages refer to the object itself, not its container. So if we change this translation to be in percentages, let's say by 100%, it's going to translate by 100% of the image's width, not its container. We can also translate on both the x and y axis together in one line by removing the x and giving our translate function two numbers separated by a comma. So we will add our brackets back and then say maybe 300 pixels to the right. Let's keep that. Add a comma and then maybe 100 pixels down. Transforms can also scale, skew, and rotate objects in addition to translating them. So we can perform all of these operations on both the x and y axis, or just one or the other. Let's add the skew rotation and the scale to our robot and see what happens. We can list additional transform functions, one right after the other, with just a space separating them. So we can add the skew here of say 40 degrees, a scale of 2, which means double size, and we will also add a rotation of 40 degrees. So we got a crazy looking robot. Transforms also have a stacking order, which means the order you apply each transformation matters. Each additional transform is compounded on top of the ones that have come before it in the list. So keep this in mind and play around with it until you get the perfect looking robot. CSS transitions are one of the ways we can create animation with CSS, even though they are not called animations. It's confusing but true. By definition, animation means causing change over time, and transitions absolutely do that. They just do it in a little bit of a different way than CSS keyframe animations do. We will be creating a button that transitions on hover to take a quick look at what CSS transitions can do. Transitions need a beginning and an end state to transition between. That's why we tend to use them on things like hover states. The initial styles of our element are the beginning state, and the hover state becomes our end state. So in our case, the button will start as a cute little red button, and the end state will be a bright, big yellowish button. So we will add the rule for a hover state, and we will start adding some properties here. On hover, I'd like to have this button both grow and change color. I think that will look cool, hopefully. We will do the color change by setting its background property to a bright yellowish hex color on the hover, and I'll use a scale transform to change its size on hover. So now we have our end state defined in our button's hover state by changing the background color, and we are adding a transform scale of 1.2 times the size it currently is. If we save that now, we can preview our example in the browser. And we have our hover state, but it's just a hard cut to the hover state. It's an instant change, not very smooth. Let's go back to our CSS and the transition to smooth this out. We apply the transition property to the object that we will be transitioning. It's like saying to the button, hi, if anything like that happens in the future, please do this. So we will add the transition property to our button. The minimum we need for a transition is a duration. We can just put in something like 0.5 seconds here, and this is essentially saying if any of your property should change, like really any of them all, take 0.5 seconds to change. With this one short property added, we have a nice transition between our hover state and the beginning state. Both the background color and the scale happen at the same time and use the same transition properties to change themselves. But we can get more granular with our transitions and give each of these two properties their own transition values. So let's go back to our CSS and do that. I'm going to delete the 0.5 seconds, and we have here a new transition property. First, we will write the transition for our background color using a transition property shorthand. So the first thing we need to do is tell it which property we like to transition, which is our background. And I want this transition to take 0.5 seconds. And we would like to use the ease in timing function. I will talk a bit more about the timing functions later. That's all we need for our first transition. To add the second transition, we want to use a comma to separate, so it will know, like the computer will know that we are creating a list and not just one long transition. Our second transition is for our transform property, and we will have this take 0.25 seconds. Why not? Which is half the time that the background transition is going to take, and yeah, we'll have it use the ease in out timing function. So if we save this now and go back to our browser, we will see that our hover transition has changed, and now our color change and scale are happening at slightly different rates. The color change is taking just a little bit longer, and the scale is happening just a little bit faster. Just by separating out different transitions for these two properties, we've already created a more interesting effect. In addition to separating them out, transitions can also be delayed. So let's add a delay to just one of our transitioning properties to see how that will change the effect. We will go back to our CSS, and I think we should add a delay to our transform property. With the transition shorthand, the second number you add for any transition is taken as the delay. So if we make our transform transition take a little bit longer, we will make it take 0.5 seconds too, but we can delay it by 0.25 seconds. Again, the second number is taken as the delay. The first number is the duration. So if we save this, we can go back to our browser and see how this changes our transition effect. Now we see the color change start even before the scale up starts to happen. And the opposite happens on the reverse. So we've created an even more exaggerated stagger of these two transitions. I think that's the basics of transitions, and let's jump into animating our so far hidden bot. CSS animations are made up of two basic building blocks: keyframes that define the stages and styles of the animation, and the animation properties that assign the keyframes to a specific CSS element and define how it is animated. Let's move over to our CSS file and do just that. The keyframes rule works like most other CSS rules in that anything contained within its curly braces are considered part of that block. The second step to our keyframes rule is giving our animation a name. I'm going to call this one slide since I'll be using it to define how the robot will gracefully slide across the screen. It's really important to name your animation because without a name, you won't be able to assign it anywhere and your keyframes will just kind of be unnamed and floating around in space. There are a few options available to us for how we can define each keyframe within our keyframe rule. Now, what we will use are the keywords from and to at first. These work just like they sound. You define where to animate from and where to animate to. It's really easy to remember and exactly what we want to do here. So we will start out saying where we want to animate from, and we are going to animate from exactly where our robot is using a transform. I've already translated the bot to minus 750 pixels on the x-axis and 500 pixels on the y-axis. So let's set the coordinates there. So it will start where I've already translated it. And then we will go to a translation of 900 pixels over to the right as our end phase. You might be wondering why I chose to use transforms for such a simple movement. I mean, why not just animate top and left position instead? Visually, it would be the same thing as if we assigned a new top and left position at the end of our keyframes, but by using translate, we will get better performance out of our browsers. So just remember, transforms will get you the best performance for your animations. Now, what we have our keyframe animated defined, our next step is apply these keyframes to an element on our page. That way we can get some animation happening. To assign an animation to an element, we give that element some additional CSS properties. So let's go to our robot class and add some extra properties there. There's a very short list of properties we need to define. The first would be the animation name. This tells our robot which set of keyframes to take on. The second property we need to define is animation duration. Our keyframes define what should change over the course of an animation, but they don't give any indication as to how long this should take. So that's what we do in animation duration. I'm going to set our duration to 2 seconds. With those two properties set, we got everything in place to see some animation. So we'll save our CSS file and go back over to our browser to preview what's changed. We just set the minimum of what we need to create a CSS animation, but there are two more properties I prefer to define explicitly for all my animations. Actually, way more properties, you will see. I think it makes my code a little easier to follow. So we will go back to our CSS and add those bunch of things. The animation timing function property has a default value if you don't set one explicitly, but I like to set the property for all my animations because it has such an important impact on the feel of the animation. Let's go over to easings.net, and so it says easing function specify the rate of change of a parameter over time. So it defines the movement, how fast it would be. There are a couple of good examples here. For example, ease in, which starts slow and then gradually speeds up. Ease out, which starts fast but slows down. Like I like to think about it, when there's a runner who just won the race and then gradually slowing down. There are also other things like linear, which is like the cloud's movement. It's in the same pace, floating calmly. All right, I'm going to set our robot's timing function to ease in. This will have our robot starting at a little bit slow and then speeding up as it gets closer to the end of the movement. A little bit like she's in a hurry to come and greet you. At least I like to believe that. The animation iteration count property is also a good one to set for yourself, even though it has a default value. This one determines how many times the animation will play. The default is set to 1 time, but let's set it explicitly so it's really easy for us to tell how many times this animation will play. We save our CSS and go back over to our browser. We will see that our animation has changed slightly. We can see a bit of an ease in there. So it's moving slightly differently, but otherwise it all looks the same. Next, to show you what more you can do with CSS animation, let's have a look at delay. Let's set an animation delay of 1 second, which means that it will wait 1 second before the animation actually executes. I have also prepared a different way you can animate, where the animation has more keyframes defining the action. As you see, there are 3 keyframes. These keyframes are also defined in percentages, which is the other option we have for defining our keyframes. So before we had from and to, and now we have percentages. You can even mix these two if you'd like, using both the keywords and the percentages, but personally I find that a little confusing, so I like to stick to one or the other. To have even more control over how our animation looks, we can set the animation fill mode. Animation fill mode is a way of telling the animating element what to do outside of the actual duration of its animation, and it can take 4 values: none, backwards, forward, and both. The default value is none if you don't declare the property at all. Forward will make the styles from our last executed keyframe have extended beyond the animation. With backwards, behind the scenes, the robot takes on the styles from the first 0% keyframe that we define and holds those styles during the delay before the animation starts. And finally, both lets us take advantage of both the forwards and backwards animation fill mode's behavior. So let's go back to atom, and add that. We will add animation fill mode and set it to both. And now when we preview our animation one last time, things are looking a whole lot better. Our animation stays at the 0% keyframe position during that 1 second animation delay at the beginning, and once the animation completes, it keeps the styles from the final frame as well. That's exactly what we want to have happen. Okay, there's just one more thing. There is one more animation property I'd like to explore here before we say goodbye, and that's the property of animation direction. Right now we've got our robot moving across the screen from left to right. But I think our robot would be a lot more interesting if it had at least changed direction. Animation direction, or direction, tomato, is a property that could help us get a lot more mileage out of our animations without having to make any major changes to our keyframes. It's like making your animation and the movement more complicated while keeping the code very simple. Animation direction can be set to normal, reverse, alternate, and alternate reverse. Normal means that all iterations of the animation will be played as specified, so your keyframes will play from start to end, exactly in the order that you wrote them. Reverse means that all iterations of your animation will be played backwards from end to start. The two alternating versions get a little more interesting. Alternate means that the direction of your animation will alternate each iteration of the animation. It will play in the normal direction the first time, so that would be 0% keyframe to 100%, and in the reverse direction the second time, so that would be 100% keyframe back to 0. The alternate reverse works in very much the same way, but it starts playing your animation in the reverse direction. So backwards first and then the normal. There is one other thing we will have to change to actually see this alternate, and that's the animation iteration count. You know, how many times the animation is played. Alternate can only be used if your animation plays more than once, because otherwise you won't have any space to see the alternating. So now, armored with all this knowledge, let's set the animation direction to alternate and change our animation iteration count to 2. With those two small changes made, we will go back to our robot and see how it's changed. Our robot plays forwards the first time in the normal direction and then backward in the reverse direction, alternating its direction with each iteration of the animation. Very cool. So these are only some of the super cool CSS animations. I hope you find this tutorial useful, and if you have any questions, do not hesitate to find me or any other fellow on the IMA Discord studio. I also put some useful links in the description here, so check those out as well. Thank you for watching and bye!